Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia Daf Tzadi Hey. This week's learning is sponsored by Helen Danzak in loving memory of Lucille Fliegler on her yurtzeit. Thinking about her warmth and her love of family, we honor her memory with our learning. This week's learning is sponsored by Rachel Savin in honor of the upcoming marriage of her daughter Lior to Danielle this Thursday. Okay, we're going to get started with a view of where we left off. Today, the beginning of today's daf is really trying to figure out, and we started this already in the previous page, what situations that are not described in the text are true anyway, okay, where we have certain things it says about a shomer chinam, certain things it says about a shomer sachar, certain things it says about a sho'el. The question is, which ones can we learn to other situations? This is something very common that happens where we have a lot of sections in the Torah that don't repeat details of other things that are kind of maybe obvious, maybe not obvious, but the rabbis try to figure out how can we learn either whether one is true for the other or if, how it is true one for the other. So the first thing we tried to deal with was just within the sho'el, all it talks about is nishbar omed, and it doesn't say shvuya, which is if it was taken in captivity, kind of captured, you would say would be a better word, but if the animal is captured by somebody else, how do you know, right? That's also ones, and it was mentioned by ones, if you remember in the psukim, where it talked in the shomer sachar, it mentioned all three. Only two are mentioned in the sho'el. Does that mean the sho'el is chayav or not chayav in the case of shvuya? So the Gemara assumes it is. The question is how, and they say the word o. And now we had a bit of a problem with the word o, because according to Rabbi Yoshia, the word o is necessary, because if you had said nishbar vimeit, according to Rabbi Yoshia's theory of drashot, or theory of how the Torah is written, you remember there was this big distinction, does a vav connect and say these two have to both be present, meaning it has to be both nishbar and mate, or you have to curse both your mother and your father to be chayav. And only if there's something else, right, telling us not, then not. Whereas Rabbi Yonatan thinks that the obvious is if it said nishbar v'mate, it really meant broke or died. Aviv ve'etimo, it meant mother or father. Okay, so according to Rabbi Yonatan, the word o is totally unnecessary. But according to Rabbi Yoshia, the word o isn't unnecessary. The word o is needed to say it's or broke, or, right, either broke or died. Otherwise, if it had said nishbar v'meit, you would have thought both. So according to Rabbi Yonatan, the word o is used for our drasha. According to Rabbi Yoshia, what are you going to say? To which the Gemara says, starting from the top of our daf, afilu tema Rabbi Yoshia l'chalek halakhot tzarich. Even though in aviv ve'etimo, you would have thought mother and father, unless it had the end of that pasuk. If you remember, it said aviv, right? Imova, aviv imo kilel, and that comes to say, oh, well, beginning of the pasuk, aviv is near kilel, and the end of the pasuk, imo is near kilel. There we learn, okay, either or. But without that, we wouldn't have known that. In this case, you don't even need that, because it says if you borrow an animal and it breaks and dies. Let's say it didn't say oh, it just said it breaks and dies. So you wouldn't think it would have to both break and die, because my time is sparahu. It's just logical that it obviously means one or the other, because mali kala kula, mali kala palga. Whereas it could be with your mother and your father, maybe the theory is you have to curse both, even though, again, it doesn't seem the most logical thing. But perhaps, again, doesn't mean you can curse one of them. It just means you're only going to get the death penalty if you curse both your parents, because that's something that theoretically could go together. But in the case where you break the leg of the animal or you kill the animal, either which way there's damage to the owner. So there would be no reason to think it would have to both break and the animal would die. And therefore, even according to Rabbi Yoshia, the word o is really unnecessary. So that's our answer to our original question, where we had two other attempts to answer the question. The third answer holds like Rabbi Natan, who says o includes also shvuya. That was question number one. Question number two. So again, we're going to say, by the sho'el, what does it say? We're going to read this pasuk many times today. We're in Shmot chapter 22, verse 13. If you borrow something from your friend, v'nishbar omet, and it breaks or dies, ba'alav einimo, that's going to be our shmira ba'alim story today, which we're going to talk about. If the ba'alim are not there, which again means when you borrowed the object, the person who you borrowed it from wasn't working for you. Okay, we'll get back to that later. You will pay. Shalem. The main point being that it only says Now, you remember our chart from Daf Tzadi Gimel. The sho'el is chayav for everything, basically. Pshia, right? We always have this hierarchy. Pshia is the one you're for sure going to be chayav. Everyone is chayav for pshia, even the shomer chinam. Geneva va'aveda, stealing, if someone steals it or it gets lost. The shomer chinam, the one who watches for free, is exempt. The shomer sachar is chayav, and the sho'el is chayav. Now the question is, how do we know the sho'el is chayav, right? According to the Torah, it only says the sho'el is chayav ba'ones, which we know everyone else is exempt from ones. It says so in the pasuk by the shomer sachar, right? But anyway, how do we know that the sho'el is chayav in Geneva va'aveda? Now it's intuitive, but they're going to say, right, because obviously for obligating ones, you're going to be obligated for something that you're, right, all the more so you're going to be responsible than some totally unexpected damage you're obligated. Obviously, you're obligated if it was stolen or lost, because that requires, a bit of lack of, not doing a good enough job if it was stolen from you, or especially if it got lost. So, so the first way to do it would be, and it's introduced with the v'chi tema, which means if you want to say it, meaning we're going to reject it. If you're going to say shvuro meta, which is ones, right? And you're going to say, well, if you're liable for ones, like I said a minute ago, obviously you're going to be liable if it gets stolen or lost. No, there's a difference. And you could reject that reason because you could claim, again, this is always just what you could claim, which means it's not a strong enough argument. You can't rectify a situation. If the animal breaks a leg, right, there was an assumption, I guess, you couldn't put cast down it and fix it. The animal breaks a leg or a limb or something, or the animal's dead, there's nothing you could do to fix the situation. That's why you have to pay. But now we never talked about this. If a shomer sachar, an item you're watching it, you get paid to watch, and it gets stolen or lost, you pay for it. And basically, while in a sense you have to pay, on the other hand, you kind of get off easy because you have no more responsibility. You pay your way and you're done. But perhaps a sho'el, which is more responsible, would have to go find the thief. Okay, their job is go be a detective or hire a detective and figure out a way to find the thief. Or you lost it, go find it. Since the owner can actually get back the original object if you make some effort, maybe that's what the law is, and maybe you don't pay. Payment, in a sense, relieves you of responsibility. So we can't say just because you're obligated when it breaks or dies, you're also for sure going to be obligated if it gets stolen, but no. Ella ki haditanya, but we'll learn it from this Braita. This Braita learns it out from the pasuk. Nishba omet, and the ella shvura ometa. The Braita starts off, it's a midrash halakhot, starts off with exactly our question. It says in the pasuk, it breaks or dies. Sounds like the only time the sho'el is going to be responsible is if it breaks or dies. How do you know that the sho'el, the borrower, is going to be obligated also if it gets stolen or lost? Amarta kava chomer, simple kava chomer argument. Since a shomer sachal, one who gets paid to watch an item, is exempt from death, right? Onus, if the animal just happens to die, or if it gets, breaks a leg, and yet is obligated in theft or getting lost, a sho'el whose deen is more stringent because they're going to be liable even for onus, unexpected damages, or circumstances beyond your control, wouldn't there be obvious then, right? Because again, that's our basic chart. Our chart was based on this logic, which is the shomer sachar has an easier law, a less strict law than the sho'el. So if it's less strict and yet it's obligated in Geneva va'aveda, obviously the more strict one is going to be obligated in Geneva va'aveda. And the Braita adds this one line, which we're going to have to explain. Zehu kava chomer she'en alav tshuva. Tshuva here doesn't mean tshuva answer. It means difficulty. Okay. By the way, you think tshuva is an answer in modern Hebrew, but in Aramaic, okay, and in the Gemara all the time, tshuva comes from the language of lahashiv, to respond. It's a response. A response could be an answer. A response could be a question. And we see it all the time in the word etive, metive. Those words, the root is yud taf bet, which is yud shin bet, because taf in Aramaic switches with shin. Yashav, lahashiv, which is where tshuva comes from. So when it says en alav tshuva, this is a kava chomer you cannot knock down. In other words, there's no argument you could bring that would knock down this kava chomer. It's such a clear-cut kava chomer. But the fact that they have to tell you this means that you might have thought you could knock it down. And then the Gemara is going to explain what might you have thought to knock down this kava chomer and why is it not a good reason to knock it down. So my ein alav tshuva. Well, the chitema, you might have thought, ikal mifrach, you could knock it down and say, again, as soon as you say that there's some chumrah about a shomer sachar, then you have no kavah chomer anymore. If you say there's some sort of stringency that exists for a shomer sachar, which doesn't exist for a sho'el, you can knock out the kavah chomer. So you could try this one, and then they're going to tell you two reasons why that's not a good argument. Mal shomer sachar shekem shalem tashlum kevel b'to'en tanat listim mizuyan. Well, okay, we had this before with the shomer chinam compared to a shomer sachar. We said maybe a shomer chinam is more strict than a shomer sachar, one who watches for free than one who gets paid. Because if you remember, a shomer chinam is exempt from theft, whereas a shomer sachar has to pay. Because the shomer chinam can be exempt by swearing if they take a false oath and say it was stolen, and really they had stolen it. Remember, that's to'en tanat ganav, and then we find out they stole it. They actually have to add a double payment. This double payment could be a chomer, which we then said it's not a chomer because what? Because it's much worse to have to pay the principal every time it's stolen. Then on the off chance that you took an oath, you'd have to pay kefil. You're going to do the same comparison when it comes to a theft by a shomer sachar that you're not obligated in, like that you could take an oath about. What would that be? A list in mizuyan. If armed robbers came and put a gun, right? They came, put a gun to your head and said, we're stealing it. So if you're a shomer sachar, you'll be exempt. Let's say you come and lie falsely and say it was stolen in that way. You'd have to pay kefil. Maybe yes, maybe no. Right now, they're going to assume you'd have to pay kefil. Okay? It's like a to'en tanat ganav. You'd have to pay the double payment if you lied about it. And obviously, a sho'el wouldn't have to do this because a sho'el would be obligated if they, right? If you borrowed something and you said, well, armed robbers came, they mugged me and they stole it, you wouldn't be exempt. You'd have to pay that. It's onus. And remember, sho'el chayav and onus. So again, they're going to try the same way they tried to knock out a kavah chomer between the shomer chinam and the shomer sachar here, and they're going to have the same rejection. So if you want to say you might say, well, they pay kefil if it was armed robbery and they lied about it and claimed it was armed robbery and really they'd stolen it themselves. Afilu hachi, but two reasons why this wouldn't work to say, oh, that makes shomer sachar more strict, because there you could have a double payment, and in a sho'el you'll never have a double payment because you can never do this kind of thing. Well, two reasons why this wouldn't work. Number one, afilu hachi karna de sho'el adifa, same way we said in shomer chinam, it's worse to have to pay Karen, the principal, anytime it gets stolen through armed robbery from you, which would be the sho'el. Then on the off chance that you lied under oath, then you'd have a kefil payment. That's still the sho'el has a much stricter din in general. Because in general, the shomer sachar will be exempt from a case of armed robbery. Ibaid ema, or alternatively, you could say maybe there is no kefil in that case anyway, because listen, Metzia and Gazlan, who, if you remember, okay, from Bava Kama days, there's only kefil for theft. Theft, which usually happens, like a thief comes in, a robber comes in at night, steals your thing, not for Gazlan. Armed robbery, generally, we say there is no kefil payment for that. So, and that's the Torah says, Ganovi Ganev, Shnaim. It doesn't say it by Gzela. There's Gzela and Geneva in the Torah, not our topic today, but perhaps listen, Mezuyan is Gazlan, and there's no kefil anyway, which means there's definitely no stringency, and that's why you can't knock out the kavah chomer. So that was our second thing we learned today. Again, first thing was, how do you know shvuya, you're chayav in a sho'el? It didn't say it in the pasuk. We learned that. How do you know Geneva va'aveda? You're chayav for sho'el. A sho'el is going to be chayav. Okay, we got that. Now working off this last one. Since Geneva va'aveda, you're chayav, and you're chayav also, the sho'el is chayav for ones. Now in ones, what did we learn? The sho'el is chayav, but we're going to go back to shmira bailee. Not if the baalim were there, right? Not, which means what? Remember? Im ba'alav imo lo yishalem. Okay, the next pasuk after the one we read says, right? The first one said, if the baalim are with him, ba'alav are not with him, then you pay. But if they are, you're exempt. Now that's said by sho'el, a borrower who has onus. How do you know that once we learn that you're also chayav in Geneva va'aveda, that ba'alav imo would be an exemption there as well? Okay, that's the big question. I will stop for just 1 minute and talk about this whole Torah of shmira bailee and give you, again, there's lots of possible reasons how we could explain the shmira bailee. It's a very strange concept because it doesn't mean the baalim are physically with you. okay, which might have more logical sense. And the truth is, we will see this later today, that there is someone who holds the baalim have to be physically with you and working with the animal, which is a whole different concept. But what it's taken by the rabbis to mean, you'll see, because the rabbis reject that explanation. It happens to be Rav Hamnuna's explanation. The rabbis basically say what it means is, if in the time when I went to borrow your object, you were working for me, okay, in some other job. Now, if you're working for me, what does it mean? It means that I can't, if you're working for me, you're mishuabad to me. You are basically subjugated to me. So I can't be subjugated to you in the same way then, because we can't have it going both ways. There's always like a hierarchy. One person works for a different person. If you're already working for me, I can't theoretically work for you, and that's why I'm going to be exempt. It's not the easiest thing to get. You could say there's a way around that, but that's the concept. There's another, I'm going with an article of Shimoni, who happens to be married to Rabbanit Shimoni, who we know from Gefet. He suggests another reason. And what he says is that, let me just, Kasher Adam Socher Mishu Kipoel, if somebody hires someone to be their worker, and in parallel, he's using the object, then these are not two separate halakhot, two separate, how do you say the word? They're not viewed on two separate planes. It's viewed as one arrangement, okay? If there's two things going on simultaneously, it's viewed as like an added element to like if I hire you as a worker and then I borrow something of yours, it's viewed as if like you're hired to work for me, and as part of the job for working for me, whether you're hired for money or not money, it doesn't matter whether you're hired and you're doing it for free, but as part of the arrangement, you're supposed to bring something with you, kind of thing. It's viewed as one complete arrangement, which means I'm not viewed as a borrower. It's just viewed as part of the arrangement. And that's what gives you the exemption. So those are two possible directions. There's more, but I don't want to spend too much time on a shiur doing it because we'll never get through the daf. But those are two ways you can do it. If you want to look it up, you can look up, like he mentions another reason there, Rav Shimoni. It's called sho'el bailee. It's in Hebrew. Okay. So now we're going to go back to our topic. We now want to know, how do we know that the exemption of shmira bailee is not only where the Torah says it is, which is by a sho'el in a case of ones, but also once we learn that a sho'el is also obligating gneva v'aveda, that the exemption applies to that as well. That if the bailee were working for you when you borrowed it, then you'd be exempt even if it gets stolen or lost. So again, you might say this is intuitive, but the Gemara has to learn it. So that's what the question is. So we got the gneva v'aveda, you're going to be obligated if you're a sho'el, but liftor minala, but how do you know you'll be exempt if ba'alavimo? They don't spell it all out, but that's what they mean. For the owner, right? If the owner was working for you. If you want to say, and again, they're going to reject this, first option, so you might say, well, if shvura v'meita, you're going to be exempt, then also this should be exempt. But that's not good logic, because you could say perhaps the exemption is only for a case of ones, and it's not for gneva v'aveda. Gneva v'aveda, right, is worse than ones. Ones is something in terms of my responsibility, right? Onus is something only a sho'el is going to be responsible for, because it's hard to make me responsible for onus. It's circumstances beyond my control that happen. Why should I be obligated? So if we're going to say a sho'el is obligated, but not in this unique case of ba'alavimo, the owner's there, then it doesn't necessarily mean we can apply it to gneva v'aveda, where I'm assumed to be more responsible. That's my whole job, is right, to make sure it doesn't get stolen. So again, not my job, I'm borrowing, but my responsibility. So that's not good. Ella, and now we're going to have a very circular thing going on here. Okay, they're going to say the following. Gamar mishomer sachar. We're going to say, well, ba'alavimo, you're exempt. A shomer sachar is exempt if, okay, again, I was hired to watch your object, and you were already, or at the same time, we made an arrangement that you were going to work for me, I'll be exempt. Even though, remember, where does the whole thing of shmira b'baalim come in? Only by sho'el. But they're going to say, since it's true also, which we're going to have to say, how do we know it's true? Right? I always call this the Superman analogy. I've got you, don't worry. And then you say, you've got me, but who's got you, right? So we've got this, right? We're going to learn it from there, but where do we learn that from? So that's why it's going to end up coming kind of full circle, and you'll see in a minute. because we're going to basically, and it's a little confusing, but this is why I'm going to put it out there at first. We're going to learn from sho'el to shomer sachar and then back to sho'el. That's why it's going to kind of come full circle. So they're going to say basically, we're going to learn from shomer sachar. Since the shomer sachar has an exemption, now the only exemption would be in a case where they're obligated. They're not obligated in onus. So the obligation for them where all of a sudden they'll be exempt, if ba'alav imo will be in gneva v'aveda, we'll learn back to the sho'el that also in gneva v'aveda, the sho'el is going to be exempt if the ba'alav imo, even if it were stolen. That's basically what we have to do. But they're going to say shomer sachar gufei minalan. So where do we learn the shomer sachar from? The shomer sachar in ba'alav imo, because remember, it's only in the psukim by the sho'el. So all we're doing right now is just learning things that don't appear in the psukim, but saying what's true for one is true for the other. We're going to learn it from the sho'el, as I told you. So we're going to go sho'el to shomer sachar, right? Okay, I'll just spell it out. A sho'el, a borrower, is going to be exempt in a case of onus when ba'alav imo. From there, we're going to learn the shomer sachar is going to be exempt from gneva v'aveda in ba'alav imo, if the baalim were there again. I'm just going to say it literally, even though that's not what it means. And then from there, we're going to learn back, once we have a shomer sachar b'gneva v'aveda is exempt in ba'alav imo, we're going to learn that back to the sho'el, that in a case of, so we go from sho'el is exempt in a case of onus, we're going to get to sho'el is exempt in a case of gneva v'aveda, if it was stolen or lost. So now we're going to say, b'mai gamar, how do we learn, right? So gamar chiyuva shomer sachar chiyuva sho'el. So again, now we're on the part where shomer sachar, we're going to learn from the sho'el, and then we're going to learn from there back to the sho'el. B'mai gamar, so how? So they're going to again go through some options. We're going to get to two, but the first one they're going to say if you're going to say sho'el sets up a paradigm in onus, you're exempt from ba'alav imo, so therefore, right, make the analogy. In a case where you're chayav in onus, you're going to be exempt if ba'alav imo. So apply that to shomer sachar. In a case where you're chayav in gneva v'aveda, you'll be exempt if in ba'alav imo. I'm sorry, if ba'alav imo. But maybe you say, but that's no. Maybe this exemption is only for an onus case, because again, it's always more likely you're going to exempt someone in an onus case. So only maybe it's true for the sho'el, where the sho'el is chayav in some unique, weird case, like total circumstance beyond your control. There will exempt you in the case where there was shmira b'bailee. But you can't necessarily learn from there to a shomer sachar when it's a gneva v'aveda where you're much more responsible. And it's, we should hold you more responsible. So we'll try a different one. Ela amarkra v'chi yishal. Now here we're going to have this a few times today. This section, if you remember, there's 3 sections in the Torah. Only the sho'el is obvious. It's a sho'el. Remember, the first section is shomer chinam. The second section, shomer sachar. The third is sho'el. The rabbis figured out, we did that the other day, that, the first section, that's what we did yesterday's stuff, but the first section, shomer chinam. The second section, shomer sachar. The third is sho'el. That's not important. We're just going to assume 1, 2, 3, and that's what each one is. But the sho'el section starts off with a vav, and, theoretically, it's a new section. It should just start ki yishal, when someone borrows. But it actually said and when it says and, that means we're connecting it to the previous section. In what way do we connect to the previous section? You could go both ways with this, and later we're going to see we do go both ways. But you can say either we learned something from the last section to the previous section, or we learned something from the previous section to the last section, okay? From 2 to 3 or 3 to 2, right? Either way. So, v'chi yishal vav mosif al inyan rishon v'yalamed elyon mitachton. Upper section, we're going to learn from the lower section, meaning we're going to say what's true for the sho'el is going to be true for the shomer sachar. This vav is basically taking the words in ba'alav imo, you're going to be exempt, and applying it to the section before. Okay? And that's pretty simple. Now, akate, but. So now, again, this is why I told you we're going to go full circle. So now we got the in-between part, which was, how do we know shomer sachar in gneva v'aveda is going to be exempt in a case where ba'alav imo? To which the Gemara is going to say, okay, fine, we got that. How do you know you can learn back from there to the sho'el? And to say that a sho'el in the case of gneva v'aveda, and not just onus like it says in the pasuk, but even if it's stolen, you'll be exempt if ba'alav imo. So akate, sho'el, and now they're going to start off with, I would think you wouldn't be able to learn it. Why? Who says you can learn from the shomer sachar to the sho'el in the case of gneva v'aveda? You can knock it out and say, maybe the exemption of bailee applies in gneva v'aveda by a paid bailee, a paid shomer, because there's exemptions by them that don't exist by a sho'el, like, for example, onus. So if they're exempt in onus and circumstances beyond their control, and they're also, theoretically, they have this added exemption by gneva v'aveda if the bailee were there, right? If the bailee were working for them. But Tomar b'sho'el shechayav b'shvur u'meita, but a sho'el has a much more strict law than everyone else because they're chayav and onus. So maybe that Torah of gneva v'aveda doesn't apply from shomer sachar to sho'el. Ela gneva v'aveda b'sho'el l'chiyuv u'mnal. And so again, back to our square one. How are we going to learn from shomer sachar to the sho'el? Well, they say, listen, the whole gneva v'aveda is learned, okay? How do we, so actually, they're not going back to the first question. Sorry, I read this wrong. They're saying, let's remember, how did we even get to the fact that a show, okay, going back to our second thing we started with today on line 4 of the stop. How do we know that gneva v'aveda, a sho'el, is even obligated for? From the shomer sachar, remember? So we have this concept, what does that mean? If you're going to learn something by kal v'chomer, you're not going to be more strict with it than the law you're learning it from. So if the whole law of the obligation of a borrower in a case of theft or loss is only if ein ba'alav imo, if you don't have some other arrangement with the owner, and then we're going to learn from gneva v'aveda is obligated also in the sho'el, we can't learn that it's going to be obligated more than the original, than the shomer sachar. So that's how we get to it. That's what they're going to say right now. I'll read it inside. You can't learn any stricter than the law itself. If the whole law is learned from the shomer sachar, we have to learn it with all its details. So, ma gneva v'aveda de shomer sachar b'baalim patur, just like gneva v'aveda and a shomer sachar. If baalim imo, shmira b'baalim, it's going to be exempt. Obviously, then, af gneva v'aveda de shomer nami b'baalim patur. So that seems like a great answer. So now again, let's just go back. We started with the shomer sachar is obligated in gneva v'aveda. From there, we learned that a sho'el is chayav in gneva v'aveda. And then we said a sho'el is exempt if ba'alav imo. We're going to learn from there to a shomer sachar that in a gneva v'aveda case, they're also exempt. And then we're going to say, so from there, we learn to the sho'el. Because of the principle dayo. We're learning the whole law of gneva v'aveda by a sho'el. We're going to have to take it with all its details that it comes with, which is there's an exemption, ba'alim imo. But that only works if you hold by this principle, dayo. Not everybody holds by it. So, hani chalamanda amar dayo, elamanda lately dayo ma'i chalamemer. And now we're going to have to come up with a different explanation because not for those who don't hold dayo. Some people say, no, you learn, okay, and there's also logic to this. You learn gneva v'aveda by a shomer sachar to a sho'el, but only in the criteria, like you could say, that a sho'el has. A sho'el has a p'tur ba'alav imo, but that's for onus. Maybe for gneva v'aveda, they'd be chayav because that's more strict. You can convince yourself of anything, right? You can argue anything. So they're going to say, and we told you this before, we're now, and this is why I told you we're going to do like a circle. We're going to say the vav in the section of the sho'el. Number 1 comes to say, the exemption of ba'alav imo is going to be applied above to the shomer sachar. And then once we have the exemption of a shomer sachar above, gneva v'aveda, we're going to say the vav now connects it back down to case 3 of the sho'el. And we're going to learn whatever details were true for there are true for there. And gneva v'aveda b'sho'el is exempt in ba'alav imo. Okay, that's how we did it. It's a little of a circle we had to do, but it works. Itmar, next section. Now we're going to have a machloket about pshi'a b'baalim, which we actually made reference to earlier in some other sugya, but now we're going to focus on. There's a machloket about pshi'a b'baalim. So we talked about, let's just talk about our categories. In general, when we talk about the shomrim, there's 3 things we're talking about. Pshi'a, right, main 3. There's a few others, but it's mainly pshi'a, gneva v'aveda, and onus. So we talked about the sho'el regarding onus. Right? The sho'el chayav even in onus, and obviously gneva v'aveda and pshi'a. Okay, we said the exemption for the ein ba'alav imo, even though it's only mentioned by ones, it's going to apply also to Kneva Vaveda. And right, we learned that from the Shomer Sachar. The thing that the Shomer Sachar is obligated for, because of this Vav, we're going to connect it back and say, it also, the Torah of Im Ba'alav Imo also applies to the previous section. Now, the question is, does it apply to the first section? The first section is a shomer chinam. Shomer chinam is only obligated for, not Kneva Vaveda, not onus, only pshia, only real negligence. So now the question is, for shomer chinam, and then it would be the same, we would do the exact same thing. It would be true also for shomer sachar and also for a sho'el. If they were negligent and the baalim were there, meaning that they were working also for them, is there an exemption too? Is it across the board an exemption? Or is it only for those two categories, but not if you're really negligent? You could see logic to both. So pshia b'baalim pliga b'rabacha b'ravina. Chadamar chayav, chadamar patur. Okay, now, what's the basis? Well, it's going to be a basis, not logical basis, but a drasha basis, because that's the two ways we know to do things, either logic or drasha. Manda amar chayav kasavar. If you hold, you're obligated. Pshia b'baalim. It doesn't matter that the baalim were working for you. You could still be obligated. Mikrani drash the panav below the pnei panav. We say the vav. The vav connects it to the previous section, but not to the section before that. So it's very obvious, right? The Vav connects and said, we're going to take shmira b'baalim and put it in the shomer sachar case. We're not going to put it back to the shomer chinam, which is pshia, which means we're not going to have pshia in any of the shomerim be exempt at all, right? If the ba'alav imo. Hilkach, im ba'alav imo shomer chinam lo ktiv, it's not relevant for shomer chinam. Upshia nami b'shomer sachar b'sho'el lo ktiv, and since it doesn't say, right, the only case it mentions pshia, just like it only mentioned the obligation for Kneva Vaveda and shomer sachar, we had to learn it from a shomer to the sho'el. Also, pshia never says by any others. It's just obvious. You're chayiv in pshia for shomer chinam. Obviously, going to be chayiv in sho'el and shomer sachar. But since pshia is not mentioned in the other sections, and we don't apply the shmira b'baalim concept to the first section. So hilkach b'shomer sachar b'sho'el l'chiyuv ati b'kavachomer m'shomer chinam. You're going to learn it from a kavachomer for shomer chinam. And if it's not true for shomer chinam, that exemption doesn't hold. Then the exemption is not going to hold by anyone else either. Aval b'baalim l'ptor. So again, you're not going to exempt in the shomer sachar and the shomer chinam, and the sho'el for ba'alav imo in pshia, because kiktiv ein ba'alav imo lo yishalem asho'el v'ashomer sachar hana chiyuve dechtivu b'hadu demichta. It's only going to be applicable in the sho'el and the shomer sachar for things that explicitly it says in the text you're obligated for, and then in those things you'll be exempt. But since pshia is never mentioned in those verses and those two sections, you won't be exempt. Okay. That's basically saying what I said before, just in a lot of words. Mandamar patur, the one who says you're exempt, is going to say the opposite, which is what? If it's all the same context and there's a vav there, and the vav is connecting it to the previous section, you could say that the vav is connecting it to the two previous sections, and that the vav is relating both to shomer chinam and to shomer sachar. And then we're going to say this exemption of ba'alav imo applies to shomer chinam in the case of pshia, and then to all the rest in a pshia, and to a shomer sachar in Kneva Vaveda, and then also to a sho'el in Kneva Vaveda, and that we have the whole picture. And then it applies also to a shomer chinam. Now we're going to bring two difficulties on this second explanation, because they don't like this idea that if you're poshea, and just because you had this arrangement with the right and the other person was working for you, you were negligent, you're going to be exempt. It seems crazy. So they bring two sources that seem to raise a problem with this, and they're both sense similar, the method that they use, even though the two sources are a little bit different. So the first one is, and each time we're going to resolve the difficulty. Tanan, the first one's our Mishnah, and it described, if you remember, a whole bunch of different cases of she'ela b'baalim. So a sho'el et ha'para v'sha'al ba'alei ima. I borrowed the para, and at the same time, I hired you to work for me. Ha-sho'el et ha'para v'sachar ba'alei ima. Okay, the first one was hired you for free. The second is the same case. I just hired you for money. Sha'al ba'alei ha'oscharan. So first I hired you either for money or for free, and then I borrowed the para, right? As long as when I borrowed the para, either we made the arrangement at the same time, or you were already working for me, that's called she'el b'baalim. V'meita, and then the animal dies, patur. That's called ba'alav imo, that's the exemption. Now notice all these cases. What type of shomer are you who's exempt? A sho'el only. No more than that, right? So notice what's missing. Shomer chinam is missing. Now, obviously, shomer sachar is missing also, but shomer chinam is missing. So they try to say, oh, look, shomer chinam is not listed here in the Mishnah. It must be there's no exemption. And that would be in pshia. To which they say, What do you mean? What do you mean it doesn't have shomer sachar either? Why does it only talk about a sho'el? Because the Mishnah used the language of the Torah. The Torah only talked about it by a sho'el. So they say, Elatana, the Tana Milta, we're now turning to Amabet. Milta dechtiva behedya katani, the ata midrasha lo katani. It only used the language of something it said explicitly in the Torah, not something that was learned out by drasha. Okay, second source, same attempt, same type, except here they're going to mention, basically the main difference here is they're going to mention in this braita, sho'el, she'ela bebalim, and schirut bebalim. Now remember what schirut is, it's renting. Schirut is never mentioned in the Torah, but we have a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and we have a machloket who says what? About whether we treat a socher like a shomer sachar or like a shomer chin. Right now, they're going to assume that the socher is like a shomer sachar, like in our Mishnah. Okay, if you remember the Mishnah, right, the approach of our Mishnah was to say it's like a shomer sachar. So tashma, she'ala v'sha'al ba'ala. So you borrowed it, and at the same time you hired the workers for no money. Schara v'schar ba'ala, or you again. Now here you rented the object, not borrowed it. Here's the rental, and at the same time you hired the workers to work for you for money. The owner to work for you. Okay, so then the next one is you borrowed and then you hired them for money, or you rented the object and you then asked the owner to work for you for free. Okay, either which way, it's all she'elar schirut bebali. Look at this language. This is important. This is telling you, even if they're working on some other thing entirely for you, not connected to this animal, we're going to come back to this later. Vameta patur. That's not the important part for our purposes right now. The important part is that we have she'ela bebalim and schirut bebalim. Now, if you assume schirut is shomer sachar, now you can't say before, oh, it only mentioned the case mentioned in the Torah. Here it mentioned sho'el and shomer sachar, and shomer chinam is clearly missing. Savrua, they thought, Hamani Rabbi Yehuda, they thought this was said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds Amar Socher Kishomer Sachar Dami. It's like a pay bailee. Vahatana Katani Milta Dati Midrasha Vilu Shamachinam Lo Katani. And this Tana, as opposed to our Mishnah, decided to list things that are also learned out by drasha. And notice what's missing, Shamachinam. So there you have it. Doesn't apply. Shmira bailee. You can't say it's exempt, otherwise they would have mentioned it. To which they obviously answer, no, Hamani, Rabbi Meir, Socher Kishomer Chinam Dami. No, you could say a socher is like a shomer chinam, in which case shomer chinam is listed here. And then Tana shomer chinam, but what in the shomer sachar? They brought the bigger chiddush of a shomer chinam. Even a shomer chinam is exempt, even in a poshea case, right? Even if it was total negligence, which would then obviously be true for a shomer sachar. It just didn't mention it because that was obvious. Or so that would then mean it's not Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Meir. Now they're just going to do, this is totally not any different content-wise. It's just a matter of who's the author of this braita. It could be, if you remember, we had this whole debate. Who says what in this debate? Socher kashomer chinam or kashomer sachar. You could say it's not like Rabbi Meir. It's actually like Rabbi Yehuda, who holds the opposite of right. That socher ketzam shalem. Rabbi Meir omer kashomer sachar. Rabbi Yehuda omer kashomer chinam. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who said shomer chinam, and then we could say this braita is like Rabbi Yehuda instead of Rabbi Meir. Either which way, the content's all the same. It means it includes shomer chinam. You can't necessarily say so. It could be shomer chinam, could be shomer sachar, but we have no way to prove, and therefore this is not a difficulty. Oh, now we're moving to Rav Hamnuna. I mentioned before, there's a whole different approach to how to understand shmira b'balim, and one that really understands it much more simply, the simple, more obvious reading of the text, which is if the balim are physically with you. And comes Rav Hamnuna and gives two limitations to this in balavimo, this exemption, and understands it totally differently, and the rabbis are going to totally reject it. So, Amar Rav Hamnuna, number one, you're going to always be chayav unless balavimo mamash, meaning if the owner was hired, okay, I borrowed your cow, and then I said, and I'm hiring you, whether for free or money, it doesn't matter, to plow with my cow. So you are now working, that's what you, balavimo, physically you're with me and you're working with your animal. Then we could see that I'm exempt because you're the one doing the work with the animal. So if the animal dies, I'm not going to be responsible because I borrowed your animal because you're doing the work for me. There's a totally different understanding of it. And not only that, he requires another thing for you to be exempt. They have to be with you from the moment you borrowed the animal until the moment it died. So if it was over a course of a month, they would have to be with you with that animal for the entire month. And if not, then you're not exempt. Now, how does he get this? Because he says, okay, going back to this vav and all that in the psukim, it says v'chi yish'al ish mi'im re'ehu. If you borrow, v'nishbar omet, and it dies or breaks, ba'alav einimo. Ba'alav einimo now refers to both those things. If ba'alav einimo, if the baalim weren't there, then you would have to pay. Meaning, but if they weren't there, if they were there, you wouldn't have to pay. That means if they weren't there, referring both to the beginning of the pasuk of v'chi yish'al and to the continuation of the pasuk v'nishbar omet. You'd have to have been there that entire time because those were all mentioned in the same verse together. So we're now going to have Mativ Rav. He brings some questions. First on the first part of what he said, and then on the second part. Mativ Rav. Sha'ala v'sha'al ba'alei, ma schara v'schar ba'alei, ma schara v'sha'al ba'alei, ma sha'ala v'schar ba'alei, ma. This is the bright we quote at the beginning of the daf, of the amud, this side of the daf. I'm not going to go through all those cases. We know all those cases, right? You rented or you borrowed and hired the workers at the same time or before. Even if the baalim are doing malacha somewhere else, b'makom acher. What is b'makom acher if not somewhere else, not having to do with this animal, right? V'meita patur, ma'ala b'malacha acheret, and you're still going to be exempt. That goes against Rav Hamnuna, who said you're only exempt if they're working with that animal. To which the Gemara is going to try to answer, but then we'll have some difficulty with the answer. We'll end resolve it, even though it's a little difficult. And we're not going to resolve it. We're going to end with a difficulty. My mistake. Okay. Lo ba'ota malacha. You could say, when it says somewhere else, it means somewhere else, but working with the animal. So the Gemara is like, what does that mean? So what does it mean somewhere else? Well, when you go to plow the field, first you loosen up the ground and then you have the animal plow the field. So if I borrowed your cow and then hired you to plow with the cow, and you were softening the ground in front, meaning you were somewhere else, you weren't, you were 10 yards away from the animal or 1 yard away from the animal or something like that. You weren't actually with the animal, but you were a little in front softening the ground. That's still considered ba'alav, okay? But that doesn't mean somewhere else entirely with not dealing with the animal. But then they say, no, that's not a good answer because listen to the seifa of that source. The continuation of that source says, Hamid seifa al gaba. It says on the animal, haviresha b'malacha acheret. They're contrasting these two. One is on the animal and one is not with the animal, right? But somewhere else. They're going to assume that means somewhere else entirely. Al gaba means right near the animal. Let's read the seifa. Dekatani seifa. Sha'alav achar kach sha'al ba'alei ma. Again, I'm not going to translate all this, but these are all these cases of sho'el b'ba'alim or shira b'ba'alim. Scharav achar kach sha'al ba'alei ma. Af al pi sha'ba'alim chorshim al. Oh, sorry, I didn't say that right. It's not the same cases. This is sha'ala and then achar kach sha'al ba'alei. In other words, if I borrowed it and you weren't working for me at the time, only later I hired you. Remember, we learned that's not sho'el b'ba'alim. Or I rented from you and only later did I make an arrangement with you that you were going to work for me. Then you could be literally, physically on the animal, working that animal. You're the owner. It doesn't matter. That's not sho'el b'ba'alim. I'm going to be chayav. So from the fact that they use al gaba here and they use makom acher there, it must be makom acher is really somewhere else. To which the Gemara says, no. I'm a reisha b'sefer b'otam malacha. They still could be saying same malacha. And reisha ributa kamashman, b'sefer ributa kamashman. Each one is trying to say, even in the case where you're exempt, even if you're a few feet in front, you're still going to be exempt. And in the case where you're obligated, because this is not called sho'el b'ba'alim, even if you're on the animal, right? So each one is focusing on a different element, right? And particular for that case. So again, I'm going to read it inside now. Reisha ributa kamashman, that's telling you a special chiddush to afagav laval gaba, even though you're not on the animal, but you're bo'otam malacha, you're preparing the land for threshing, for plowing. Since they were there from the moment of she'ela and they're there now, then yes, you're going to be exempt since in the beginning they were already working for you when you borrowed it then. And sefer ributa kamashman the afagav dal gaba kevan delo avu ba'alim b'shat she'ela chayav. And the second part stressing that even though, right, since this isn't sho'el b'ba'alim, it doesn't matter if they're actually on the animal, moving the animal, leading it physically. To which the Gemara says, no, that really, it's very hard to say makom acher is really the same action. You're dealing with the animal. It's much more of a bigger chiddush to say that the reisha is even if you're not even working with that animal. And the seifa is even if you're working with the animal. It has nothing to do with, right, whether you're working. And basically they're going to say, Whether you're a few feet in front or a few feet behind, on the animal, that's not a big difference. The bigger difference in what they're really trying to contrast is you could be working on something entirely different, but as long as at the moment of she'elah, they were working for you, which is the way we've been understanding, right? You're going to be exempt. And even if you're working the animal, it wasn't arranged from the beginning and you weren't working in the beginning, then you're not exempt. And therefore they reject Rav Hamnuna, the first part of Rav Hamnuna. Now we're going to bring two difficulties on the second part of Rav Hamnuna. With that, we'll finish. We'll leave the last part of today's stuff for tomorrow. Ve'od. Now remember, he says you have to be from the time of she'elah till the time it dies or breaks. The owner has to be there physically. Time. Now these two bright Torah are going to basically be saying one and the same thing, and they're darshaning these two psukim. They're just going in a different order. The psukims again by sho'el say, if you borrowed your animal and it breaks, you borrowed an animal. Ba'alav ein imo shalem mishalem. If the owner is not there, you have to pay. And then it says im ba'alav imo lo yishalem. And if the owner is there, you don't have to pay. Now, theoretically, you didn't need both of them because they're both saying the same thing, right? If this you don't, if this you do, it's obvious. So that's what both bright Torah are going to say. They're just each going to start from a different pasuk, the one that you are obligated or you aren't obligated. Im ba'alav imo lo yishalem. So this one starts out mimash. Sorry, I skipped the first two words. Mimash mashenemar, from the understanding of these words, im ba'alav imo lo yishalem. If the owner's there, you don't have to pay. Eini yodea sheba'alav imo shalem yishalem. What? I wouldn't have known that if they are there, you'd have to pay. It would be obviis. Ela matamud lomar ba'alav imo. So what do we learn from the fact that it's repeated? Lomar lecha haya imo b'shat she'ela ein tzarich liot imo b'shat shvura b'meita. And haya imo b'shat shvura b'meita tzarich liot imo b'shat she'ela. We learn both these things that if it was there with you in the moment of borrowing, that's what's going to exempt you. And if it wasn't there in the moment of borrowing, even though it was there in the time that the animal died, it doesn't matter because if you only hire the person to work for you later, and then that won't help you, that won't make you exempt. That's what we learned from that there's different cases where, right, it doesn't apply across the board. V'tanya idach, in a second braita. Now, this implies, by the way, you don't have, it just has to be the ba'alav imo b'shat she'elah, not at the end, which goes against Rav Hamnuna. And the second braita basically says one and the same thing a little bit differently, but starts up with the other verse. And idach mimash mashinah ba'alav ein imo shalem mishalem. They start with the pasuk where you are obligated to pay if the owner's not there. Does that not imply that if the owner's there, you would have to pay? So what do you learn from that? As long as it leaves the reshut of the mash'il for one moment, meaning that as long as again, this is a weird way of saying it, but what they're saying is as long as in the beginning, the bailee were there, at the moment of she'elah, it doesn't matter if they're not there after, you're exempt. Okay, which again is tiyufta to Rav Hamnuna, tiyufta. And in the end, we reject Rav Hamnuna from both those reasons. And what you might have thought was more intuitive, that if the owner's there and present, then you're going to be exempt from she'elah. That's not it. It's more this other idea, which is because you hired them, right? That's going to give you this. That's going to be what's going to give you the exemption. So what we did today, for the most part, was we tried to find all these drashot for explaining things that didn't appear in the psukim, but we know to be true, and learned it out from homers or other kind of deductions. And then we went to this machloket about shi'ur bailee, are you exempt or not? We had a debate, and then it brought two difficulties against the side that said shi'ur bailee, you would be exempt. They didn't like that. They brought two difficulties, but in the end rejected them. And then we had this other approach of Rav Hamnuna of shmira bailee, and that we rejected because it just didn't fit with any of the sources we know to be true about shmira bailee. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov and Shema B'Sarot Tovot. And we'll pick up from bailee, which is going to kind of connect with the top of the next stop, and we'll leave all that for tomorrow. Have a good day.